to Province House. It's in buildings of destiny such as this that you can feel history come alive. And during the first 8 days of September in 1864, history was made right here that would change the face of North America.
In 1864, when men of all parties laid aside for the time all old differences and united for the one great object.
Now, doesn't that sum up Canada's spirit of today? Setting aside our differences and working together for the greater good. That's what John A. Macdonald here found when he came to Charlottetown to attend a conference on maritime union at Province House more than 150 years ago. And the great object John A. was referring to was not the union of the maritime colonies, but nothing less than the Confederation of Canada. Indifference, greed, fear, stubbornness, diverse loyalties, neglect, and differing visions were just some of the obstacles the British colonies needed to overcome if there was even a glimmer of hope for Confederation. You see, the maritime colonies saw little advantage of national union. They were all loyal to Britain, and their individual colonial economies thrived as they built ships and sent timber, fish, and produce to England, Europe, and America. So, why rock the boat? Well, things changed in the 1860s. Britain, being the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, had become the greatest economic power in the world. It felt like it no longer needed to protect its colonial trade, as the whole world was now its marketplace. It was looking to cut the costs and trim the fat. What seemed to be the answer to them was to create a self-sufficient super colony in British North America that could govern and defend itself, and foot the bill by itself too. A perfect storm was brewing in 1864, involving two fronts. The warm front was Britain's colonial office, putting pressure on the colony's governors to unite, while the cold front came from the south. The United States were in the midst of a bloody civil war, and some feared that the Americans would invade the British North American colonies at the war's end. New Brunswick was the first colony to react, suggesting a meeting to discuss maritime union involving itself, Nova Scotia, and PEI. But a call for startup talks didn't stir up much action from the other maritime colonies, especially from PEI. It seemed the thought of any sort of union would die even before it was born. So what got it going again? Oddly enough, what revived the maritime union talks was a simple request by the new coalition government of the United Province of Canada. Led by John A. Macdonald, Georges-Étienne Cartier, and George Brown, this shaky coalition had managed to break the political gridlock the province of Canada had been stuck in for years. But Brown and his Reform Party only lent their support to Macdonald and Cartier under the condition that the three of them would work together towards a national union. Having heard wind of the Maritime Union Conference, they asked if they could crash the party, and they had plans to be the life of it. That's if Macdonald and Brown could get along. You see, they tended to butt heads, with Cartier often stepping in as the go-between, or the voice of reason. I bet he'll be left paying the bill. With the interest shown by the Province of Canada, a Maritime Union Conference date was set. To accommodate the reluctance of PEI, who felt that discussing maritime union wasn't worth the effort of traveling for, it was decided that New Brunswick and Nova Scotia would come to Charlottetown. And the party crashers, the Province of Canada, they were included at the last minute as observers. So what was supposed to be first a casual chat on potential maritime union had now grown into something much bigger. There were 8 delegates coming from the Province of Canada to meet with the 5 delegates from New Brunswick and the 5 delegates from Nova Scotia on an island whose 5 delegates weren't really interested in participating in the conference in the first place. Now that's Canadian cooperation for you. By September 1st, 1864, all the delegates had arrived to this middle-sized British North American city of 7,000 inhabitants with its red dirt streets. Back then, Charlottetown's waterfront was filled with the sounds of shipping and shipbuilding. Now, one of the greatest defining moments in Canada's history was to play out in its most prominent building, Province House, originally known as the Colonial Building. This dignified neoclassical structure, designed by local builder Isaac Smith, once housed Prince Edward Island's Supreme Court and has been the home of Prince Edward Island's legislature since 1847. Today, Province House remains one of the oldest functioning parliamentary buildings in the world, and more than a century and a half ago, it became the central meeting place for the Charlottetown Conference. Over the course of the conference, it didn't take long for the Canadian delegates to win over the maritime delegates on the prospects of a greater national union.
With the proper balance of power between the federal government and the provinces, Confederation will bring such prosperity.
So how did Macdonald and the Canadians, as you remember, we're only here to observe, do it? Plain and simple, they wooed the other delegates with their charm and conviction, especially Macdonald. Their pitch was well presented, well received, and exactly what was needed for the times.
And let us not repeat the mistakes of the Americans, who are now divided in the rages of civil war.
All the 23 delegates, who would later be known as the Fathers of Confederation, were either prominent members of the respective political parties in power or members of their legislative opposition. On the surface, they were a group of men who were essentially alike. But despite their obvious common characteristics, there were many differences between them that could cause conflict during the conference. For some, their ancestors had been longtime enemies in Europe and in North America. France and Britain had fought long and hard for supremacy in the New World, and there were still differences between the two cultures that needed to be ironed out. For others, different religious beliefs could act as potential roadblocks. And for those delegates born in the colonies, the possible feelings of resentment towards recent arrivals might bring about a question of loyalties. But what was on the table was much more important than any prejudice any of them might have had. Putting aside their differences, they were united in giving the possibility of Confederation at least a chance.
United, we represent a burgeoning nation that the world will envy.
As the delegates deliberated over the finer points of union, there were voices missing at the table. There were many who would be affected by Confederation but did not have the opportunity to have their say. Considering Aboriginal peoples' rich and ancient diversity spread across their traditional lands on which they have been continuously living since time immemorial, and their pivotal contribution to the history, the culture, and the defense of British North America during the War of 1812 and the other conflicts, excluding them is hard for us to believe today. But unfortunately, for the policymakers of the 1860s, it was business as usual.
Gentlemen, just imagine the vast opportunities that await us all.
There was another group with more than one half of the colony's population, and some would even argue more than one half of the intelligence, that were also not invited to the conference. Women in Victorian society had little political power or legal equality, but they still managed to get a word in edgewise regarding the topic of the day, especially during organized social gatherings.
Monsieur Cartier, les maritimes n'ont besoin que d'un traitement équitable de la part du Haut-Canada. Un petit coup de pouce mène beaucoup plus loin qu'un coup de poing, vous savez.
Très bon conseil qui nous servira à tous, madame.
Taking into account what was at stake, it was important for the delegates to mix pleasure with the business of nation building. It smoothed out the sharp edges of intense negotiations and helped to create new friendships and alliances. It was at parties like this that the delegates could let their guard down and get to better know one another.
Ah, my dear Mr. Brown, if you deliberate about eating an oyster, you never will. They are a delicacy of the sea, and at times concealing a fine pearl within their midst.
If they were concealing dirt, I'd still devour them, as they are a pleasure that I rarely have the opportunity to enjoy.
Then eat your fill, mon ami, and hopefully, in the near future, the only dirt we shall share will be that of a unified land.
Here.
As the week progressed, MacDonald and his delegation wished to repay the kindness and hospitality that had been shown to them. On September 3rd, after rigorous meetings at Province House, the Canadians held a lavish champagne luncheon on board their steamship, the Queen Victoria. It was during this gathering that it became more and more obvious that the maritime delegates were now leaning towards a national confederation. Proof of this was how George Brown described the luncheon as a bit like a wedding in a letter to his wife, Anne Brown.
The bands of matrimony between all the provinces of British North America, having been formally proclaimed and all manner of persons duly warned then and there to speak or forever hold their tongues, no man appeared to forbid, and the union was thereupon formally completed and proclaimed.
Finally, all the delegates were on the same page and in the same boat. The Charlottetown Conference, held in this stately old building, was a critical turning point in history, not only for what was to become Canada, but also for the United States and the British Empire. Although nothing had been formally signed, by the end of the conference, the delegates had reached a general agreement on confederation, not just a maritime union. This monumental first step would eventually result in the creation of a great new nation, larger than its neighbors to the south, and ultimately deny Americans their dream of occupying all of North America. Confederation also satisfied the wishes of Britain, the creation of a super colony with its own self-government.
The people of the lower provinces and of Canada have been separated for too long. Our hearts are one. Our loyalty and attachment to the throne of England one. Why, I have every reason to believe that the results of the convention would lead to the formation and establishment of such a federation of all the British North American provinces.
It is a gratifying fact for the British American provinces that they could claim as their ancestry two of the greatest nations of the world. I believe that the results of our deliberations will end in a grand confederation of the British provinces, such as must prove beneficial to all and an injury to none.
It will be the proudest day in the history of British America when we unite hand in hand and form a nation, which in all of the elements which constitute true greatness, which, at no day too distant, shall be looked upon as one of the greatest and most important events of the present age.
The many heartfelt toasts continued late into the night, followed by a grand ball that lasted until 4 a.m. the next morning. The success of the Charlottetown Conference filled the delegates with great optimism. It began quite simply with the desire to put aside differences, and as MacDonald would later say, unite for the one great object. After conferences in Quebec City and London, England, Confederation went ahead on July 1st, 1867, with Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia forming the Dominion of Canada. Ironically, Prince Edward Island, which would later be embraced as the cradle of Confederation, initially declined to be a part of the Dominion of Canada, as the terms were still not to their liking. It wasn't until 1873 that they changed their minds, and that Prince Edward Island was welcomed into Canada's waiting arms as its 7th province. As for Province House, well, It was declared a National Historic Site in 1966, one of the hundreds of protected heritage places looked after by Parks Canada. Prince Edward Islanders and Canadians alike can take great pride that in this historic building of destiny, where Prince Edward Island's legislature still gathers, the Fathers of Confederation walked over its worn stones to hammer out a vision for a united Canada.